Good evening, everyone. It is really, really an honor. This is to be here tonight as the culmination, obviously, of everything that's gone into doing this book. And there's only one place where you can launch a book called The Future is Asian. And of course, it's the Asia Society. So I really do want to thank my friends Sanjeev and John for the extraordinary efforts they've made to bring us all here together tonight. And to David, to Mike, to Danny for joining me here. It's a real honor and a privilege. Of course, the threshold for impressing a room full of Asia hands is very, very high, and therefore I'm going to make my remarks as short as possible. But what I wanted to do is to present just a couple of slides to help us just kick off the conversation, which can obviously lead in many, many different directions when we're talking about this incredibly vast canvas known as Asia. So I'll stick first to maybe what I know best, and that's geography. And one of my motivations for doing this book was the simple fact that so much of the literature about Asia in the last 20 years, and it's of course important that we have that growing body of analysis, is that it's really just been about China, Greater China, the Pacific Rim. There have been exceptions, but a comprehensive look at the Asian geography and the return of what I call the Greater Asia has been missing. And here you see what the proper geographic depiction of Asia is. And as you can see, it stretches. Well, you can't quite see the Mediterranean Sea here, and you can't quite see the Red Sea, but that's technically where Asia begins. So it is a realm of 4.5 billion people, 40-some countries, more than 50% of the world population is Asia. The other, I believe, sort of, shortcoming, if you want to call it, in a lot of analysis about Asia is that, it's very ahistorical. We live in the moment. We see China as the center of not only the Asian universe, but even to some degree the future of the global system as its sort of sole anchor. But what I try to do is to put China in context. And from a standpoint of the collective Asian economic miracle, it's a story that predates China and will extend beyond China. But it's not a story of competing national blocks. It's a story of mutually reinforcing waves. So let me just point out here how I see that playing out. It's a little bit small, but the Asian economic miracle begins, of course, with Japan in the post-war decades, rapidly rising to become the world's second largest economy. It was the Japanese story that inspired the tiger economies, South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, right, through the 70s and 80s. And then it was, of course, 40 years ago that China began its process of opening up and reform. And who were the largest initial investors, and to this day, some of the most consistent and steady investors in China's modernization and growth? Of course, Japan and the tigers. So that brings us to the present. And for many people, again, it's as if history has stopped, as if the wheel, as if time stands still. But the way I see it, the next wave of Asian growth is just getting going, right? And what you see happening today is that if you take the next wave of countries, South Asia and Southeast Asia, from Pakistan through India, through ASEAN, you have 2.5 billion people, right? So 1 billion more people than China. You have a younger median age. In some cases, such as India, you have faster growth rates than China. You have also countries that are receiving more foreign investment than China. ASEAN as a region has received more FDI than China for the last 5 years. In 2018, India received more FDI than China. A lot of this is secular dynamics based on labor wage arbitrage, again, the demographics, the opening and reform in these economies, and so forth. So how can we continue to be so China-centric when we look at Asia, even economically? So I'm trying to skate to where the puck is going, so to speak. And what I see is, again, not either or. There's mutually reinforcing dynamics in this picture. And we'll come to Belton Road and so forth, but it's part of the story of how the wealthy and aging Asian societies are investing in the next wave of growth rather than viewing everything through strictly the geopolitical prism of historical and territorial rivalries. A second point I want to make is about how these countries fit together into a whole that is greater than just the sum of the parts. And there's a chapter in the book called Asianomics where I go into the things that I just mentioned, but also how, particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, Asia has been focused on, in a way, rebuilding, resurrecting the Silk Roads. And it relies, very logically, in a way, on the economic complementarities that exist across this Asian landscape. You had the energy supercycle beginning in the 1990s, the West Asian economies, and again, atypically for a book about Asia, I talk a lot about West Asia. I don't call it the Middle East. For whether or not you are of Indian extraction or descent, you know very well that this is geographically West Asia. But if you are Indian, then you know that whether it's yourself or your father, in my case, my grandfather was an Indian diplomat, you would never use the phrase Middle East, right? It's West Asia. And so there's a lot in this book about West Asia. And really, it's now 20 years into the story, since the energy supercycle, the commodity supercycle, of West Asia trading far more with East Asia than with the rest of the world. What I did to produce this chart, just to quickly explain, is to go back 15 years, 10 years, 5 years, and up to the present, to show how the trade volumes between pairs of countries or sub-regions in Asia have been expanding, and indeed they have. So you pick any two countries here on this map and you'll see the tremendous rise in the complementarities and the trade volumes between them, whether it's commodities, industrial goods. And again, this reflects many other things. For example, you can plot investment flows onto this, you can look at commodities, you can look at the airline routes that are intensifying, the number of business travelers and tourists. You can see the migration patterns as well, as young Asian societies start to fill the labor gaps in aging Asian societies. I talk a bit in the book about how Japan has never had such a large number of foreign-born residents in its country. China too. It's of course a drop in the bucket, right? But it's more than before. You have intermarriage rising and so forth. We don't tend to think of Asia evolving in that way, but it is. Final point I want to make before we get into the discussion is very much about the Belton Road. And again, Belton Road only acquired a name a couple of years ago. But for me, there's a sort of a personal history to the fact that I've spent a lot of time in the last 20 years backpacking through every country on this map. Every book I've written, including this one, is a reflection of my firsthand kind of experiences of traveling in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, you name it. And I have been writing about and witnessing firsthand both Chinese and other countries-sponsored infrastructure projects and the impact that has on the economies and the geopolitics of the region. So a lot of us may have woken up to Belton Road just in the last couple of years, but this pattern of, again, reconnecting, resurrecting the Silk Roads goes back to exactly 30 years ago with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that's why, in pointing that out, is critical to appreciating the sort of time scale, because we look at Belton Road as if it's a specific set of bilateral interventions that can be switched on and off, right? As if, if relations sour with one country, that's the end of infrastructure finance there. But it's not true. It's a much deeper, broader process because it's a response to the market failure of infrastructure finance that afflicts this region. Remember, on this map, on this rectangle, is the majority of humanity, right? More than 50% of the world population has suffered from this deficit in infrastructure. And China has rightly responded. It has done so sometimes in the right ways, sometimes in the wrong ways, but there is inevitability. And one of the central arguments I make in the book, and probably one that's still unique at this point, is that what China has done in a very short amount of time is not to necessarily dominate its neighbors and ensnare them all in debt traps, but it's awakened them, and it's awakened the rest of the world to enter into what I call the infrastructure arms race. Right? Because before a couple of years ago, you didn't have Europe saying, we're going to have an Asia connectivity initiative. You didn't have the U.S. saying, let's do a U.S. IFDC and compete with China for infrastructure projects and financing them in peripheral countries in Asia. And others now have their own. Japan and India have their connectivity initiative as well. And an infrastructure arms race, let me make a sort of normative point, is the best kind of arms race. Right? It's the kind of arms race that is actually going to stimulate the development of all of the countries in this region, if managed well, right? And if there's competition on commercial terms, it can hopefully lower the interest rates that countries pay. Competition in terms of the professional services can lead to higher standards and higher quality of the infrastructure and services that's delivered. So I sort of, leave you with this, I almost implore that we let this play out, but that we actively participate in it. And we're going to talk a lot about U.S. foreign policy tonight. And I argue throughout that, even though the United States is not geographically contiguous, it's not an Asian power geographically, it's a Pacific power. But in order to remain relevant to this Asian story that has really taken off over the last 30 years, it's going to have to make extra efforts to participate. And that means things like joining the TPP trade agreement. It means finding ways to cooperate both with China and others around all of these infrastructure projects. And ultimately, that's how you make something like this a win-win. Now, I know there's a lot of nuances now to get into. So before I go any further, let's talk about them. Thank you again so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Parag. That was a terrific setup for the book, but also for the discussion. And for those of you who may be confused, I'm the one who wasn't an ambassador and wasn't a trade representative for the United States government. So that leaves Michael as the center here. So I'll start with Ambassador Froman Michael here.
Mike is
okay. You were in the Obama administration, and those of us who followed it at all heard a lot about, you would say, rebalancing. Some people call it a pivot toward Asia. When you were inside the administration, how much of what we just heard from Parag set that basis for making that sort of rebalancing of the U.S. strategy?
Well, thank you. First of all, it's great to be here. Thank you for doing this. Congratulations on the book, and it really is a terrific contribution. Look, I think there is a lot of foundation for the rebalancing strategy that comes from the kind of analysis that Parag has laid out, because as the administration came in, and Danny Russell was central to this, it was the realization that for a significant period of time, the U.S. had been really preoccupied with West Asia. I'll use your terminology. Right. With West Asia.
It doesn't roll off the tongue.
No, it takes a little while to get used to. And while they were preoccupied with West Asia, there was an awful lot going on in the rest of the world, and particularly Asia, the rest of Asia. And that was where a lot of the future growth was going to come from, the future population, the dynamism of the global economy, that we had strong economic interests, geoeconomic interests, geopolitical interests, and we needed to shift attention away from being stuck in a rut, I think it was the word that was sometimes used, in one region of the world, and make sure that we were following and being engaged in developments elsewhere, and elsewhere in particular in a region that was going to determine a lot of our long-term interests. I think the interesting thing about your map is, and people, I think very few people will say this at Parag, is that you're insufficiently ambitious.
That's the first time I've ever heard that.
Because there is, the whole fundamental question is that the region that we're talking about, which is the Asia landmass and associated islands and continents with China at the center, or are we talking about the Asia-Pacific region? Right. With the United States and Latin America and Canada and the rest, all part of this community as well. And that was really the debate. And the goal of TPP and the rest was to say, we want to make sure this region is not defined solely as China-centric. China's obviously going to be the dominant factor in the region over the long term, as it has been historically. But that we want to make sure that this is a region that's defined in a trans-Pacific character, where the U.S. has a strong interest, and where we have demonstrated an interest, at least for the last 75 years, in terms of providing a security umbrella, making it possible for Japan and the Tigers and the rest of the economy to grow the way that they have, and to set a set of values and rules for a rules-based system that is in our interest as well.
And Indo-Pacific as well, so would you support or advocate for that evolution that's happened in the last year or so in terminology?
I think India is a critical part of this. We could debate about whether India being part of APEC is likely to produce more trade liberalization through that forum or not. But I think there's no doubt that India plays a critical role there.
So it makes perfect sense if there's a potential rivalry. It helps sometimes to define the group larger. So it's not one against one, right? But let's be very direct. But for China and the rise of China, would the U.S. government have gone through that strategic review at all? Would we be here having this discussion tonight, but for the rise of China?
I mean, I think China was obviously critical to that, absolutely. But as Parag has pointed out, it's a much more diverse region than China itself, whether it's India, whether it's our interest in Japan, Southeast Asia, and the like. And the fact that the populations of that region and the economic dynamism of that region were going to have an effect on us one way or the other. Certainly the rise of China and the reemergence of China in that regard was probably the catalyst, certainly, for the rebalancing. But it was broader than just China.
Parag, one of the questions is, for what purpose are we asking the question about the region, whether it includes the United States as the Pacific Rim or whether it's Asia as you've defined it? And I wonder if you define it large enough. If you, as you said, what's 40 countries, it's about 60% of the people, it's huge. At some point, can you even regard it as an entity? Does it hold together?
Yeah.
Is it cohesive
Yeah.
in that? Because this is very different from Europe and certainly different from North America.
The word to capture, I think, where you're getting at is system, and this is where the book really begins, because in international relations theory, the word system has a very specific meaning, then I stick to it. And that is that the units in the system have more interaction with each other, whether it's trade, whether it is diplomatic ties and so forth, than they do with entities outside the system. So by looking at the world today and reducing it in a very reductionist way, as we tend to do, to a G2, a US-China rivalry, we ignore the fact that there is, in fact, an Asian system, right? And China is central to that system. And therefore, I'll give you a couple examples. If you think about the US-China trade war, you would neglect the fact that China trades more with its principal Asian neighbors than it does with us, right? If you add up just Chinese trade with South Korea, with Japan, with India, with ASEAN, that there alone is pretty much more than its trade with the United States. And China's second largest set of trading partners is Europe, right? So if we were to really frame, not push aside every other country and region in the world as if they don't matter. The world is just a bipolar. It's a new Cold War, which is the term du jour. But instead, appreciate that there is already this thing, this Asian system. I think we would have a different view as to how things like the trade war play out, and even the geopolitics. So similarly, along the same lines, the second point being that if you look at Asia as a system and not just China plus or whatever China wants, you would also appreciate that Asia's history is very much multipolar. It's a very diverse set of civilizations that have had a very hard time conquering each other for any meaningful period of time. And therefore, in terms of how we frame a grand strategy for America towards Asia, it would be to promote a multipolar Asia rather than simply to think about how we contain or confront or limit Chinese activity, right? Because the most natural hedge against China's rise per se is strengthening those other countries because that's also what they want, and that's where they've been historically to maintain balance in the region. So less commitment from us. Now, I don't want to argue that we haven't done that, because actually we have in some ways, right? So I'm not saying that this is a sort of blank slate or anything of the sort, but I think we have not, the G2 framing, the new Cold War framing has not necessarily been helpful. And just the third little point is around, again, the East-West Asia thing, because you said, let's get out of the rut, let's focus on this other region. But the more you see the connectivity that's already quite deep between them, the more one appreciates that even our West Asian problems that we've treated as being so distinct and geographically isolated have East Asian, right, or Central Asian dimensions to them. And I remember when I was serving in the Department of Defense and going back and forth between Iraq and Afghanistan, we talked about these countries as if they were two different sides of the planet. We've got our bad failing war over here and our good fight over here. There's only one country in between them. And today, when you look at the investment volumes going into the new contracts and commercial activity and so forth, we forget that Asians, and that there's a sort of what I call in the book the Arab-Asian nexus that is deepening. So we have to think of Asia as this whole, even though it isn't unified and is never going to be unified, right? The metric or the yardstick for whether or not Asia is coming together is not whether they're building a supranational entity or have a Brussels-like capital, right? It's really about whether or not they can keep their geoeconomic complementarities and integration on one track and their geopolitical rivalries on another track and contained.
Which leads to the question, insofar as there's a system here, and I wonder if you agree there's a system, is it really trade, commerce, investment? Because historically, if you go back, and you draw the analogy to Europe in the 19th century, Parag, and to North America, United States in the 20th century, there was more than just trade and commerce that brought those countries together in one thing. Is there more here fundamentally than trade and commerce? Now, you were the trade representative, so it would be perfectly okay to say that's enough. That's enough, yeah.
Look, I'm not sure I completely buy into the systemic view of this, in that these countries all need to have a positive and constructive relationship with China. There's no doubt, right? And you're right, it's not a G2 world, and certainly our approach in the Obama administration was we're going to have a deep relationship with India, building on the good work that the Bush administration had done before in that strategic partnership. We're going to engage ASEAN directly and at the highest levels of the East Asian Summit, and we're going to use APEC broadly. We're going to strengthen our alliances across the region, and we're going to do trade. And to me, that's a systemic thing. It's got political, it's got military, it's got security, it's got economics. It's about not just our economic interests and where we're going to get raw materials from and who we're going to export our products to, but it's about what are the rules of the road for the region and what are the rules of the road for the economy and how are those going to be defined, and bringing people to the table with a wide range of perspectives from Japan to Vietnam to sit down together to define the rules to define the rules of the road. And then, of course, it's got political and strategic spillover effect. I mean, you're all much more Asian experts than I am, but it's not as though these countries have a long history of comedy and unity. There's no love lost between a lot of these countries, and the geopolitical rivalries are real. And I think the effort underway is not to sort of embrace some system, but more to find ways of accommodating the need to work with the obvious dominant party in the region while still maintaining the national interests that pull them apart.
And that's what, one other aspect of a system is, again, the diplomatic. So I have this Venn diagram in the book that shows you kind of Asia building out its own institutions. And again, they're all quite nations. Some of them are quite superficial. ASEAN Regional Forum, for example, is hardly, a legally binding entity, right? Yeah, they
hold hands and sing.
They do hold hands, but that's not what I mean by binding. And then you've got the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that might go into effect this year. And then you've got Belton Road that many countries have joined. So there is the beginnings of, and again, institutions matter a lot in building these system-like characteristics. And again, these things have emerged from within Asia, for sure. They've borrowed from the World Trade Organization template, for example. All free trade agreements do in some way, shape, or form. So there is, I go to great lengths, I think, to not view the rise of Asia as a zero-sum game, right? Because I think that's also a critical difference between traditional approaches to world order, in which, I don't even want to say traditional, I would just call them narrow and misguided, in which one posits that there always must be one number one. I mean, a lot of geopolitical conversations today start with who's number one. Before we leave this room, we must answer the question, who's number one? People are not willing to accept that we're actually living for the first time in history in a global multipolar system. Not a Eurocentric one, not just European or Western powers that have a divide global hegemony, but rather one in which you have North America and America as a superpower, Europe being very important, and multiple Asian powers. We've never had a world like that, ever, right? And so we have to accept that multipolarity, and that Asia can actually start to build from the bottom up its own attitudes, its own approaches. Again, but there's a learning process. The world has learned a lot from 19th century Europeanization. It's learned a lot from 20th century Americanization. And what you see when you spend time all over Asia is that there isn't so much a rejection of those things. It's an absorption. It's what do we want to keep from the past, from our past as colonies and so forth, in order to adapt them to our own model, to build a better future for ourselves. It's a very, very pragmatic region to a large degree.
But I think there's a fundamental difference there. I'm sorry.
No.
Is it okay if I argue?
You're supposed to.
Okay, all right. I think there's a fundamental difference in that those other examples, whether it was the European-centric example or the American century per se, they were both about marshaling our values and our interests in setting a global system. Right. And what we haven't seen yet out of China or out of Asia is anything that goes beyond the region. Yeah. And in fact, I think China has thus far resisted taking on any global responsibilities. Yeah. Part of what we did in institutionalizing the G20 versus the G7 or G8 as the central body for international economic coordination was the recognition that China and India and Indonesia, needed to be at the table, needed to be a major part of the players. But there's a difference between being at the table and being willing to pick up the check every once in a while. Right. And what we've seen is they want a seat at the table, but they've not yet been willing to take on those kinds of global responsibilities.
Let me be just very pointed in that point. I was going to ask you, actually, given your analysis, is there going to be a Bretton Woods from Asia? Are we going to replace the international economic order? Are we going to have a new version of the IMF, the World Bank, whatever it is? Exactly, an Asia version. So what's going to come after?
But the Asian version that goes beyond Asia.
No, exactly. No, it has
a global version.
A global version, yeah.
So two answers. First of all, I think this is the question I was just trying to answer in the sense that why would they want to simply discard the lessons of the past and the inheritance of the past and the good best practices of the past in terms of being able to take the codes and the rules that make sense for them from the existing multilateral architecture. This is why you still have pro-globalization sentiment, you have intra-Asian trade liberalization going on, borrowing from the WTO playbook, while we have a president right now who's threatening to sort of pull out of it, not knowing what would come next. So again, there's a pragmatism there about why would you need to see Asia replace wholesale things that work. They don't want to actually do that. The other thing is, and this gets to Mike's point, because Asia is largely poor, right, and because most of the world population is in Asia anyway, why would we expect that even 50 years from now when Asia is rich, that they necessarily want to create an Asian-centric global system? It may be happening by stealth, it may be happening de facto. We could not have sat here 20 years ago and imagined that most Latin American countries would have China as their largest trading partner, and or maybe 25 years ago, we certainly, when we were talking about the Monroe Doctrine, or still living in that kind of mentality, or that for a lot of South American countries, India has become their fastest growing trading partner. Maurizio Macri of Argentina is heading on to India on a state visit. So, there is this, it's happening by sort of in a de facto kind of way. Again, Belton Road, like it or not, is a good example of, externalizing Asian priorities and practices. Again, it is not a formal institutional rule book. It is not meant to displace or replace the Western order. Why would Asians want to when their primary concern is their own geography, because they are, after all, themselves the majority of the world population? You don't need to govern this. And if you look at Chinese practices in Africa, for example, a lot of people used to paint this straight line, between Chinese imports of commodities from certain African countries, whether it's oil and gas or cobalt, and sort of say, well, this is the new colonialism. But you can actually see in some African countries a pullback from China when they're no longer importing as much, right? They're going to be less likely to simply bail out those countries and provide, long-term credit and so forth. So they're not necessarily interested in in creating a new global system.
Well, I think that's what's interesting as your book points out, this is a heterogeneous region. Compare the role of Japan,
right,
which has, in quite remarkable ways, stepped up to play a global leadership role, right, and to fill a void as the United States has stepped back, whether it's on the trade front, or in some other areas, versus the role of China, which is not, largely. Mm-hmm. And what does that say? Is it because Japan has a different view of Asia than it views itself as somehow more interested in global governance than China, or that there's a free rider issue that China would like to continue to ride on the best benefits of the Western defined rules-based system, paying as little dues as possible to that system while continuing to strengthen the ties of its neighboring states in order to benefit from that kind of regional integration? I think that's the question going forward. To David's point, is China going to drive a new global Bretton Woods? Mm-hmm. More likely Japan would, punching way above its weight. But what the role then is China going to play going forward? Mm-hmm.
Well, if and one of the reasons that I have a whole chapter on Japan is because I think that it's been underappreciated, right, as a lender. But of course, they're motivated by several factors that are just different from China's circumstances. One is, of course, the historical legacy for which they're atoning. The other is being an insular, an island that is not versus China, which borders 14 countries, right? Japan is in fundamentally different circumstances. It only has capital market power, if you will. It's not going to be. It tried this, obviously, not very successfully, to play that military role in the region and beyond. But to this day, as Mike, as you know very well, Japan's FDI stock globally is still much larger than China's. China is catching up rapidly, but we cannot appreciate the developments that are happening across Asia or elsewhere without fundamentally taking into account what Japan has done. And China is free riding on some of those developments. If you look at how it goes after getting certain contracts in countries that have benefited from Japan's presence there, like Myanmar, Indonesia, and so forth.
So I'm a bit concerned that we're actually going against the grain of your book, in the sense that one of the theses I took from the book was it shouldn't all be about China.
Right.
And we're proving the point that we tend to focus on China. So let's talk about something beyond China, although related to China. What constraints are there on China? For example, India. Take a look at India. India,
Absolutely.
as you pointed out, is growing faster.
Right.
And frankly, in many ways, we have more in common in terms of values and legal systems with India than we do with China.
Yeah. So, there are, as I said, Asia is historically multi-civilizational, multipolar, and whereas we traditionally view China, traditionally meaning just in the last 10, 15 years of analysis, of having time on its side, having a long-term vision, more or less being able to get what it wants and wait out its rivals and outmaneuver them, you sort of see today with the rising confidence of countries like India that they also view time as being on their side, with their young populations, their fast growth rates, massive investments in infrastructure, military modernization, again, launching their own diplomatic initiatives, and of course, being able to play on the suspicion that all of China's neighbors have towards it, right? And so in that sense, the constraints to China's rise, the hedges against China's hegemonic behavior have come up a lot faster than people would have anticipated. And because we have not been giving enough credit to their agency, right, and to their own ambitions and to the history that they have in dealing with China themselves and maneuvering, which was part of the point I was making earlier. A grand strategy for America should be to accelerate as rapidly as possible and to assist in Asia becoming as multipolar as it has historically been as quickly as possible. And India is a part of that. Now, the Doklam Plateau standoff, is obviously an interesting example from the summer of 2017, where one would not have anticipated, given the military imbalance between the two, that it would be China that would blink. But actually, it makes total sense, because what China sees is not its vast power asymmetry vis-a-vis its neighbors. What it sees, fundamentally, is that, again, it has 14 neighbors. So if you deliver a beatdown to one, that really does jeopardize and imperil your operations and your schemes and designs on the other 13, because it only heightens their suspicion. Let me give you the example of Sri Lanka. We're all familiar with the episode of the Hambantota port, where Sri Lanka took on a tremendous amount of debt in order to build a port that it doesn't need, and now wasn't able to pay back loans on time, and found itself in one of these you'd call it extraterritorial debt for equity swap lease agreements over the port. And for a lot of us sitting in New York and Washington, what this meant, this was the first domino to fall, right? And that's what the media was saying, that's what analysts were saying. This is the beginning of many such falling dominoes and the spread of this Chinese neocolonialism, new British East India Company model. What we didn't realize, again, because we don't ascribe sufficient agency to these countries, even if they're weak, is that every cabinet, every government along the Indian Ocean rim and in Asia convened that next morning and said, we need to avoid becoming the next Sri Lanka, right? So instead of there being 10 Sri Lankas since the Sri Lanka episode, we are not going to have any, right? And instead what you have is Myanmar saying, let's reduce this debt. You've got Pakistan saying, instead of a $60 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor, let's make it more like 30 or less. Right? So countries, there is, again, these rapid feedback loops. There's learning. Everyone is monitoring everyone else. The difference between the 18th century, when it truly was a colonial world, and today is that you have sovereignty. Right? You can regulate your economic systems to try to prevent others from over manipulating them. You have democracy, right? You have in Sri Lanka itself, Rajapaksa, who had cut the deals with the Chinese, tried to stage a coup, more or less over Christmas. You might have missed it if you were on holiday, and to come back, he wasn't able to, right? So country after country is saying, hold on. And, we didn't think that would, because we tend to view geopolitics in this linear fashion, but it's very, very nonlinear. And so the pushback, I like to say what it took European empires 300 years of experience to learn that the locals can resist and say no. China is learning in 3 years. So I think we really do have to study these other countries a lot more carefully. They are so much more important than we tend to give them credit for, and they do have a voice in all of this.
So, Michael, taking this multipolar view of Asia for a minute, how do you form U.S. policy in that world? That's much more complicated than just figuring out what do we do with China, what do we do with
It is, but
Egypt.
I think Parag has it right, which is you need to be developing each of these relationships, whether it's bilateral or through these sub-regional organizations. So you need a strong relationship with India. You need one with your treaty partners of Japan and Korea and Australia and New Zealand. You need to have a deep relationship with ASEAN, which is increasingly important, and invest the kind of time and energy and senior level of attention to have that independent relationship, as we did with the East Asia Summit or with APEC or others, or with TPP itself, so that you're creating habits of cooperation among countries. The goal of these summit meetings, the summit meetings themselves don't necessarily produce a heck of a lot. This is on the record. I can't supposed to say that, but
don't repeat that.
Communiques are not an end in and of themselves. It's about the habits of cooperation that get created among countries and the spillover potential effects between economics, geoeconomics, geopolitics, and broader interests. But it takes hard work, and it's got to be a concerted effort, and it's been built up over decades and between Republican and Democratic administrations. And I think now the question is, have we created a void that allows those relationships to unfortunately deteriorate, or to allow China to step in where otherwise there was a bit of a counterbalancing dynamic?
Well, and I have a feeling we're going to turn to President Trump here. It just feels like that's where we're going. But before we get to that, was there a larger trend, actually? Because what you describe requires a lot of bandwidth, a lot of people, a lot of expertise, a lot of money, frankly. And the United States does not have the resources it did a generation ago to invest in these places. Do we have, as a government, the resources? And the follow-on question is, increasingly that we're going to have to rely upon the private sector, the multinational corporations, things like that, to step in where a generation ago we would have relied upon the U.S. government.
I would say, actually, yes, I think you're right. I mean, we're never, whatever we do on development finance and infrastructure investment, we're never going to be able to match China dollar for dollar. And that shouldn't be our goal, because we have other assets to deploy as well. Historically, it's been our political leadership, our values, our military, and the security umbrella that we provided, and the role of the private sector, and the fact that American companies have been actively involved there, and involved in generally a very positive way. I think one of the things, just to build on what Parag said and his views on the infrastructure arms race, infrastructure is a good thing, and in some respects we should welcome the development of infrastructure in countries that need it. But the countries themselves, it has to work for them too, whether it's in Africa or whether they're Belton Road initiative participants. It's got to be on the level. It's got to be to the highest standards. The whole back and forth around the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was, will it live up to the standards that the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank have developed over decades when it comes to environmental protection or displacing people? Or will there be a lot of corruption, a lot of cutting corners, a lot of no-bid contracts? And so that's where it's not just money. I don't think it's going to be an issue of who's got the bigger checkbook. I think it's going to be also who can bring all these other attributes to the table as well.
But to deliver those benefits, those virtues of the history, the accumulated wisdom, the experience that Western governments and firms have, one has to be inside the tent. And I think Mike began to articulate what I think is sort of a three-part strategy towards whatever our resource deficits may be diplomatically and handicaps may be, at least in principle, three things we should be doing. The first is the obvious one, like you said, restore and strengthen the relationships with the existing allies. The second, by the way, is very controversial, but Graham Allison did a piece this weekend also mentioning, which was that Russia is actually a country that we're going to have to inevitably re-engage with. It's very concerned about its power asymmetry vis-a-vis China. The same applies to other countries that we've generally isolated, like Iran, right? Whenever Iran has an opportunity to take commercial tender or acquisition from a European partner versus a Chinese one, it's going to go with the European one, right? And we have evidence of that over the last few years in terms of gas field development and so forth. So if you think about, again, what are the natural hedges to China not being able to have its way with countries that have no choice in the marketplace because we've frozen them out? Well, if we engage with them, actually, that gives them that choice. And guess what? They're going to be just as cautious about China as everyone who's actually China's neighbor. The third point is the one about the institutions that Mike said. And one of the arguments I make that's at this point literally too controversial for print, but eventually it will get out there, is that we should actually join the Belton Road. And you heard it here first, but let me explain what I mean, which is that the Belton Road, again, is China, and then 30, 40, 50, whatever growing number of far weaker countries. But in the Belton Road Charter, it actually says we respect the principles of free enterprise, the private sector must lead, and so forth. But is that actually going to happen when China and a whole bunch of, I don't want to be crude, but sort of less than well-governed states gather together in Beijing for a big kumbaya? Not really going to happen. The only way you're actually going to make sure that the standards are high and so forth, and that the loans are not at non-concessional rates, is if America is there, Canada is there, Germany is there, Britain is there, and then we say, hey, wait a minute, why did, whether fill in the blank, Angola or Mozambique or Oman or whomever, just forced into these terms that don't make sense for them. But instead, if you're there, if you're a signatory to this, you can say, hey, wait a minute. No, I mean, one thing's for sure. If you know anything about Germany and German businesses and a company like Siemens, they're not going to allow a Chinese contractor to get the sort of inside track on something when they can compete and they're better, right? So we need to be inside the tent. And this is not a radical theory. It's not a hypothetical. This is exactly how diplomacy operates. We created Bretton Woods institutions, and now as rising powers have come in, they challenge our views, right? They dilute us from within, right? They speak against us. China has experienced this itself already with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, which was sometimes described as the NATO of the East. But India has been lobbying to join the group. And now that Russia acquiesced and supported India joining the group, now it's a group that China founded, and China can't always get what it wants. So how do you make sure that in a club like the Belton Road is, very loosely defined with no real normative, sort of superstructure, how do you make sure that it doesn't just get what it wants? You actually join it.
So let me be the sort of, I'll admit, sort of unreconstructed American here, okay, reacting to that. The way you describe One Belt One Road, it sort of sounds like the Marshall Plan. And I never in the past confused One Belt, One Road with the Marshall Plan. No. The Marshall Plan seemed to be very differently motivated than that. My impression was, it's the rule I learned back in college was Tanstaffel, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Mm-hmm. That basically China is doing this for good and sufficient reason for their own best interests. Yeah. But for us to go in and play into that, don't we play into that quite directly?
No, we're actually doing, this is what I described as the roadmap, the tactical roadmap to getting to exactly what Mike said, which is how do we help these countries actually pick the best projects that are going to actually help them grow so that they become, because we're not going to compete with China on building, bridges and roads and deploying even the volume of loans that they are. But we want these economies to grow because they're going to be our next set of export markets, right, in Asia. And the richer they get, the more they're going to want to, I hate to use the phrase, buy American, but you know what I mean. And otherwise, it's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because this is what we fear. Why else would we be so, cynical about China if we didn't fear their intentions, which is exactly the nature of your question. If you're actually asking, what are you going to do about it, you cannot but come to the conclusion that I've come to, which is that you have to get inside the tent and compete.
So, Mike, let's put you on the spot.
Might be a slightly different answer.
Well, I was going to say, so let's put you back on the National Security Council, National Economic Council. Yeah. The memo crosses your desk. let's join One Belt, One Road.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Look, I think the concern is real, but I think I don't have great faith that from inside we're going to be able to have the kind of influence given where it is. And I would instead be working with the countries in Central Asia, in the other parts of Asia, to make sure that they've got the tools available to negotiate the very best deals, that they're getting good advice. You're hopefully strengthening governance and making sure that there's not corruption, so that you're limiting whatever the negative consequences of it might be. But I think at this point, I don't think it's really realistic to think that we can join and have any significant amount of influence over it. And by the way, separate from Belton Road, looking at Africa, I think we need to do the same thing. I think there, where China's been active for a number of years, as you said, including building infrastructure, I think a number of African countries have stood up and said, well, we don't like the quality of the work, we don't like the impact on governance, we don't like the political strings that come attached, and are beginning to stand up, and we ought to, again, it's in their interest to get investment in infrastructure. We can't argue with that. And we're not likely to build a lot of roads across Africa. One reason we launched Power Africa is because, to your point, there was private sector interest and capacity in the United States to invest in electricity generation and transmission in Africa. That's an area where we could help contribute, and in a way that was above board with high standards, subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the like. And that's the kind of role that I think we can play.
I just want to build on that because, again, one of the things we underestimate is the extent to which other Asians are also riding coattails on China for their own benefit. And what I try to do in the case of Africa in the book is to kind of document how China has had this first mover advantage in many countries. It's gone in, built the relationships, built some of the infrastructure, started to transform commercial relationships and the landscape to its own benefit. But given the dissatisfaction that sometimes exists with China, the door is then open to other Asian countries. So what I've shown in the case of Ethiopia and other countries is that what has happened is that in the cases where there's, again, dissatisfaction, disappointment, termination of relationships with Chinese companies, Indians move right in. Right. You can see it in textiles, for example, in Ethiopia. You can see it in Nigeria as well with some of the activity. India as a whole, India has really prioritized Nigeria, for example, and you can see it in other countries too. We often forget that because of the legacy of the British Empire,
there's a long history of India and Africa,
there are millions of, but if you look at the cover of The Economist magazine, that's not what you're going to see. You're going to see a Chinese sentry riding on a horse marching across Africa, forgetting that you have 3 million Indians living just in mostly in East Africa alone.
Right.
So again, we need a much more nuanced picture of Asia's collective impact, and it isn't just China's impact. Sometimes China is just opening the door, then it kind of turns around and walks away or gets kicked out, and then other Asians move in.
So, Parag, you provided a very powerful prism, as it were, in your book, of a way to look at issues contemporarily. Let's put it through for a couple of things. USChina Trade talks right now. Ambassador Lighthizer on his way to Beijing. Take everything you've said in your book and your analysis about the rise of Asia. How should the U.S. be approaching that set of questions?
Well, I would first start with the things that are already underway in the Asian economic dynamics, China and otherwise, and use that as a baseline before sort of prescribing a reaction, right, or a response. Because, again, one of the things that we have sort of failed to appreciate as a sort of baseline or initial condition is that there has been a growing intra-regional trade between China and its Northeast Asian neighbors in particular, such as Japan and South Korea. And one of the things that doesn't make the headlines when we are always looking at China or Asia through our own lens or through the prism of a bilateral trade war is that one of the things that China and Japan and South Korea have already done is to say, let's work towards liberalizing our trade a little bit further. And for China, that suits their interests very well because if we have imposed, rightly, one might suggest, export controls on certain sensitive technologies or products, that makes it more difficult for Qualcomm or Intel, NVIDIA, and others to sell to their traditional Chinese, clients. That then is an opportunity for the chip makers, of South Korea and Japan, Taiwan, right? I mean, we're not the only ones who make semiconductors, right? We make very good ones, for sure. And back when Chinese firms like ZTE, right, were, sort of unicorns. They really needed they needed to know that customers wanted to know there's Intel inside, right, to use their slogan, because the brand mattered a lot. But today, your multi-hundred-billion-dollar Chinese, firms, they might just switch to buying chips from TSMC or Shinetsu, Samsung, whatever the case may be. So one of the things we have to appreciate as the kind of dynamic here is that we might be encouraging an intra-Asian process of trying to substitute for us as a result of this trade war. So now it makes much more sense for Mike to answer what we should do about it.
Well, I think Parag's right. I think when these sorts of trade actions do have impact, and it disrupts certain supply relationships, and it will create new supply relationships. And the question is, if we get through the current unpleasantness and get back to tariffs go away and we go back to a more normal relationship under some agreement, do the relationships revert or not? Do people come back to our farmers? Do they come back to our semiconductors? Do they come back to our tractor producers? Or not, and we won't know the answer to that for some time. I think it's probably the case that having introduced the concept of uncertainty at a much higher level into supply chains, they're going to be hedging their bets, whether it's moving factories out of China into other countries where they don't feel they're going to be subject to the same risk of sanctions, or diversifying their supply chains more generally, but we'll have to see how that plays out. I think the challenge is that there is a lot of intra-regional trade, and including trade liberalization, whether it's the RCEP negotiations going on or the other negotiations. They are generally what we would in the trade wonk world call low standard agreements, right? They're not really major opening agreements. They're not really setting new rules at high standards. And so from a U.S. perspective, we're not likely to see the kinds of evolution going on in Asia among themselves without the U.S. pushing for it. And that's why the U.S. is pushing, as I gather, not just for more soybeans and planes and tractors and LNG to be sold, but also for some fundamental structural reforms around intellectual property, forced technology transfer, state-owned enterprise, subsidies, and the like.
So in just a couple of minutes, we're going to open this up for questions. So just be thinking about the questions you want to ask.
It's
So
interesting.
but no, I want to raise one other issue before, if we could.
Yeah.
The World Bank. It's in the news right now. David Malpass, nominated. He's been outspoken in saying, wait a second, what are we doing with China being the second biggest recipient of below-market loans from the World Bank? Does he have a point, Mike?
Well, I think there is a point more generally, which it goes to the WTO, it goes to the climate regime, and it goes to the multilateral development banks, which is we've had a world for a long time in which there were for a red line division between developed and developing countries. And now we have a country like China, which has a lot of poor people, but is also globally competitive on a whole variety of areas. And I think one has to look at these different fora and say, is it really appropriate for China to be treated the same as Chad? China is not Chad. And more should be expected of China in terms of disciplines, opening up, contributing to the global system, than a country that has much less capability than it does to compete globally. So whether David Malpass is right or wrong on that particular issue, I think, in the climate area, when we moved from the Kyoto regime to the Copenhagen regime and ultimately to Paris, it was a recognition that we're not going to solve climate without every country, including China, even though it's under the list of developing countries, taking on responsibilities. Same now is true of the WTO. I don't think there's really any prospect of moving forward with much meaningful the WTO unless China is willing to say, even though I'm listed as a developing country, I'm willing to take responsibility for the global system, for the rules-based system that I benefited so much from, as if I were one of the two major economies in the world, which they are.
So Parag, what about it? Is your book Exhibit A in the case for David Malpass?
Again, I'm focusing on the fact that within Asia, they're quite all right with these low standard agreements because they all have their domestic constituencies to please, right? They all have their sectors that receive a lot of industrial support, and they're comfortable with industrial policy. They're comfortable with a strong role for the state in the economy. Mixed capitalism is very much the norm in Asia. So you're absolutely right that from our point of view, we want to see high standard agreements. We want to see market opening. But at the same time, we have to appreciate that trade is, again, it's not just two players. A trade war has 7 or 8, major players in it. And the Europeans who share our view that China needs to open up, it needs to protect IP, there has to be more reciprocal market access. Otherwise, they're not going to grant China recognition as a market economy. So they can agree with us in principle and yet also want to eat our lunch at the same time when it comes to just look at Boeing and Airbus. I shudder to think what's going to happen if 5-10 years from now, the 15 Chinese airlines decide that, well, we don't owe that much to America anymore. We're not, we're going to be maybe not trading as much with America, but we're trading more with Europe. So why do 50-50 in terms of our airline procurement, Boeing, Airbus? What if we start to do 60-40, 70-30, buy more Airbus? And of course, they're moving up the value chain, making their own aircraft. I don't want to be the first on the maiden flight, maybe second or third. But point being that, basically what our allies in geopolitics, but our competitors in in trade are saying is, well, even though China is doing all of these, illegal things we don't like, while there's still a window to grab that market share before China has moved towards self-sufficiency, let's grab it while we can. And if the U.S. is going to almost voluntarily reduce its positioning and access in the market by not joining TPP and so forth, we're just going to take advantage of it. So you've conflicting, contradictory interests at play here.
Okay, Parag, Mike, thank you very much. A great conversation, but now it's your time. It's your time now to ask some questions. And the rules, as I understand, this is all on the record, and they have some microphones. Please stand up, give your name, affiliation if there's any, and use the microphone so everyone can hear if you could. So right here, please, down in front. No.
It's a question, Mr. Khan. I very much like your comments, no question about that. Could you comment about the role of China in the Security Council, how they express their policies? Thank you.
It's an issue that actually hasn't gotten much attention lately. We talked about it a lot more back when, there was also debates around Security Council expansion. Those seem to have disappeared, and whether or not China would play an accommodating role towards other rising powers. And whether or not it still has a policy that's more or less consistent with the notion that it doesn't want to see the sovereignty violated of some of its client states or allies. So it stands with Russia, Venezuela now as well, Cuba historically, Iran, and all that kind of stuff. So I haven't seen any significant modification, or one would say, a more liberal bent in terms of its approach to global responsibility in that particular body, which is, of course, very consistent with what Mike has been saying with respect to trade and other areas of global governance. But let me make a separate point, because I wrote a whole book about this earlier about global governance. I mean, we just make the mistake of holding diplomatic entities or bodies as synonymous with the issue itself. You have global trade without just the WTO and its role. You have global security dynamics, irrespective of what the UN Security Council decides to weigh in or not, and so on and so forth. So it's quite frankly, irrespective of what China's position is or becomes, it's still a decreasingly relevant body. And that is much more significant a fact than whatever changes in the internal dynamics.
Okay, another back here. The lady right there, please.
Hi, Robin Meredith, author of The Elephant and the Dragon. I want to challenge you, Parag, because you have this wonderful, relentlessly positive view of the developments of things. I want to ask you what can go wrong, because it seems to me there are two really important things happening right now. One is globalization is under threat, in part because of trade wars, but in part because the U.S. is challenging how China plays in globalization. Globalization has helped U.S. consumers, U.S. companies, and Chinese workers. That's the main thing. At the same time, we have a real challenge to the post-war order. So U.S. allies that have been there since the Marshall Plan are really under different pressures now because of China's economic rise. So those two things are producing really big changes here. What can go wrong? And if you could address the military side too.
Right. No, I think, and that is the place to start when it comes to what could go wrong. So let me focus just on the military and the geopolitical, and then this globalization question. There are plenty of downside scenarios, and I always talk about them and write about them. I don't deal in predictions, but in scenarios, right? And there's plenty. And one of the things I've tried to document in the last couple of books is that there are at least 9 major conflict formations that we believe could spill over and escalate and become World War III. And all of them are in Asia, right? So I try systematically to deal with them. And again, what I've pointed out is that in each of those dynamics, whether it's through the diplomacy that's taken place between those countries, certainly the quiet or overt role of the United States as a deterrent or as a diplomatic arbiter, by one way or the other, none of these major wars has yet sort of blown up. Taiwan, Japan, China, South China Sea, and so forth. So again, we play a role in some of those, but not in all of them, right? India, China as well. So any one of them, right? But I would not, and again, I relentlessly attack Eurocentric historical analogies in this book and show how irrelevant they are to Asian context. If you have a war between 2 Asian powers today, it does not mean that it's 1914 and there's an automatic escalation between a rigid set of alliances and miscalculations lead to war. That is not how Asians view each other. It's not the way Asian history operates. They don't have these rigid alliances or not with each other. It's much more fluid. They're much more frenemies, right? And they much more say, well, if those 2 are fighting over there, we're just going to let them do that, right? So let's not jump to conclusions. If there is a war, that doesn't invalidate sort of the broader trajectory. In many ways, this is a sort of sociological point, but when you have conflict and war, it actually does end, right? And then you move beyond it. And in some of these conflicts, it's whether it is diplomatically resolved or violently, chances are Asian conflicts will actually be limited in scope geographically, right? So I think there's bad scenarios, but there's a silver lining to them. There's an environmental issue that we haven't really even talked about. But a lot of the global downside, right, from climate change, rising sea levels, melting glaciers, right, Asians get hit the worst by this. Such a large percent of the world population lives in coastal Asian cities. We have large volumes of infrastructure investment, fast-growing economies, and yet they are, like everyone else, little price takers, right, to this phenomenon. And so they're significant concerns. So plenty of downside scenarios, but each of them has to be taken one by one at different timescales. And then just on globalization, I have to point out, globalization is not a rosy, positive, inert, sort of normative superstructure on the world that just exists outside of the players within it. Globalization, for thousands of years, has and remains an imperial enterprise, right? And I've devoted hundreds of pages to kind of writing about this because it's a wonderful subject to dispel the notion that there's this thing of globalization and Trump is attacking it from here and China is undermining it from here. No, when China goes out with state capitalism and goes out and tries to lay down 5G everywhere, that's still globalization. You may not like the type of globalization that it is, but it's still globalization. We have competitive globalizations going on. There's what America exports and imports in its model and its behavior. There's what China does. There's what Europe does. We have many competing globalizations. And globalization with a big G is just the sum total of those little g's. So we shouldn't romanticize it at all. But globalization will continue no matter what because besides what we are doing, and besides things like Brexit, right? Much of Asia really likes globalization. As you yourself pointed out, Chinese workers have benefited. Billions of Asians have been lifted out of poverty. They're still getting all the outsourcing, right? They're still the factory floor of the WorldNet floor. Factory floor is spreading. So Asians are still pretty bullish on globalization. If it winds up being more regionalization than true geographic globalization, which again it's not, by the way, because again, look at the volumes of trade between Asia and Latin America and Asia and Africa and so forth. There's still plenty of globalization going on no matter what we do. So let's not lose sight of the big picture. So I'm pretty sort of, I say it also in a bigger picture sense because every week you've got a magazine cover. I did a podcast last week with The Economist. The theme was slowbalization and so forth. But I take it all with a big grain of salt, because where you stand on globalization seems to really depend on where you sit. And everyone thinks that they're at the center of the picture without realizing that there's multiple centers, right? And I think it's very important to put that in. It's bigger than all of us.
So, Mike, is that right? Do you agree with that? Is globalization going to happen with or without us?
I do agree with that last point. And in fact, it's beyond Asia. I mean, there's further work going on to integrate the economies. CPTPP, completely different, has moved ahead with the other 11 countries, or is in the process of moving ahead with the other 11 countries. The Pacific Alliance in the Western Hemisphere continues to broaden and deepen their integration. Africa is moving ahead with its comprehensive, its continental-wide free trade agreement. So I think you continue to see, and even Brexit, while it's in fact a major move towards de-integration potentially with the European Union, the debate within Europe is, well, we want to have more, bigger, better, freer trade agreements with the world. We think we can do it better than we can as a member of the European Union. It wasn't really anti-globalization. It was anti-Brussels and anti-EU. So I do think, in fact, ironically, I think the fact that the U.S. has taken a step back from globalization has reinforced in other countries the need to step forward, because many of them have put their economic futures and have seen the positive economic developments of the last 70 years in terms of globalization, and want to make sure that from their perspective, continues.
Okay, you've had your hand up back here, sir.
We're going to be here all night.
Yellow.
William Lemmy, Long Island University. I go back to global leadership. China, India, the United States put half the CO2 in the atmosphere every year. Shouldn't China have been leading about global leadership in terms of changing the policy towards climate change? Look at Asia, Himalayan mountains, right? River systems. They're all vulnerable to big climate change. The monsoons could be alternated by climate change. Typhoons are increasing. How, in your travels to Asia, are you seeing a reckoning now?
And the thing about climate, and the thing about the environment as a public good, right, is that there's going to be an uneven distribution of the externalities, the effects. There's going to be a non-uniform kind of recognition and action, right? You have a collective action problem. It's global, and it's certainly in Asia too. In fact, you have a situation where, of course, with China's damming of the rivers, to get back to Robin's question as well, one of the scary scenarios, people talk about water wars. I don't like to use the phrase water wars, but just to introduce the subject, I'm just using the term. But I mean, China's damming of the Mekong and the headwaters of the Brahmaputra and so forth in Tibet, this is very worrying for downstream countries, again, South Asia and Southeast Asia. So, there's a manipulation of the environment almost in anticipation of the resource stress that's coming as a result of rising temperatures and the desire to make one's own land more fertile and so forth. There is almost a zero-sumness to some of the ways in which countries are acting. Then on the other hand, and I leave it to Mike to comment on whether or not the efforts that you see China and other countries making in terms of really investing in and deploying the lower cost technologies around alternative renewable energy, whether that's going to make a material impact, and whether their export of those technologies, as much as they're also exporting coal-fired power plants, but can it make a difference? Is it enough? I'm just curious.
My sense is, and I'm not as close to it as I used to be, is that it's not enough. I mean, they've certainly taken some very important steps, and they, I think, have stepped up, at least rhetorically, to understand that they have to take some responsibility for this as well, for all the reasons you said and others. On the other hand, in practice, I think we have a lot of very mixed results, including the continuing building of coal-fired power plants, placing them around the world, increasing emissions rather than decreasing emissions, and the like.
Okay, Frank Wisner, who does not need to identify himself.
No. Thank you for being
here,
Frank.
very much. I really found this fascinating.
We want to make sure everyone way back there can hear you, Frank.
Really found this absolutely fascinating. And I'm very glad even at the end the word TPP came up, because I'm sure I'm among many this evening who really deeply, Mike, regret its failure, non-passage, the United States withdrawal from it. The right way to put it. But let's look ahead. There is the replacement institution you talked about. At what price will the United States have to pay to enter that institution at a later date? And is that a price that you can imagine the United States could manage politically as well in terms of policy? And second, what is China's eventual relationship with a larger
TPP. Yeah.
or with a TPP with the United States inside it?
Great. I think it would be, I think the other countries would welcome the U.S. back into the CPTPP, and they even created the mechanism and the incentives to do so. When they moved ahead with it, they took a couple dozen provisions that were of particular interest to the United States and put them to the side and indicated that if and when the U.S. was interested in rejoining, that those would be back on the table and be back part of the overall regime. So the other countries are quite eager for the U.S. To rejoin. And it's interesting that even without the U.S. there, because obviously access to U.S. market was a major incentive for a number of the countries with whom we did not already have an FTA, you have additional countries wanting to join and beginning the process of consultation to say they want to be part of this high standard, broader trans-Pacific regional agreement. So I think it will continue to evolve, although not with the strategic value to us and some of the original design that was there. You know, the original strategy was through TPP, and you know, one of the things about TPP is it was large and small countries, rich and poor countries, developed and developing, and so you couldn't accuse it of being, you know, just a rich man's club. You had Vietnam and Peru and Brunei and others at the table defining these rules in such a way that if those countries could come together and sign the rules, high standards, and you could do the same with the European Union, you suddenly get 2/3 or 3/4 of the world saying this is the high standards going forward. It makes it easier over time for the Chinas, the Indias, the other countries to come on board. And I think that's where the answer to your second question, which is what is the ultimate relationship? It was never directed as a way of containing China. It was directed as a way of setting standards for China to ultimately have to aspire to. And, you know, hopefully, whether it's with the U.S. in now, later, never, but with other countries in, it too will see the value of signing up to a high standard sort of regime.
Okay, other questions? Yes, right here. We'll come back to you, I promise. I promise, you're next.
Hi, Liam Kraft. Going back to the U.S. foreign policy towards the Belt Road Initiative sort of topic, if on one hand the U.S. should kind of avoid sort of a self-defeating sort of approach that argues against infrastructure development in Asia, and is kind of going to take a more sort of cooperative and positive sort of outlook towards Belton Road, how should the U.S. sort of balance that against kind of the geopolitical sort of vulnerabilities, especially that India faces in kind of the Indo-Pacific region as China kind of gains more influence in that region? How can the U.S. kind of balance going too far in the positive direction that sort of upsets India, but also being a little bit more constructive?
Well, to be honest, I make the same argument to Indians. You know, when the Belton Road Summit happened almost 2 years ago, India boycotted out of principle because of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor projects traversing Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. But guess what? Like I said, when you're not in the tent, no one misses you, right? You think when that jamboree was happening in Beijing, anyone stopped to ask, hey, where are the Indians? You know, we miss them. No, they're busy making deals, right? And I make the same point to us as the United States. It's not about being more cooperative and friendly in orientation the way you're describing. It's completely and totally cynical. The reason we should show up in Beijing is precisely because we are utterly cynical and suspicious, and rightly so, about how these deals are playing out. And the only way to challenge it is to say, hey, wait a minute, why deal with them? You know, we're supposed to follow this sort of charter. Again, the charter says free market, free enterprise, and so forth. It's not going to happen unless we go there and fight for it, right? It's not about being obsequious and subservient to some Chinese system. It's actually, to quote-unquote join Belt and Road, you actually just sign, a memorandum with the Chinese Ministry of Commerce saying that you support the idea of the new Silk Road. Talk about low standard. It's the lowest possible standard, right? After all, some of the most corrupt, authoritarian little countries in the world are a member of it. So I'm just saying be there and compete. Now we will also, Simon, this gets to your question as well, compete from the outside, compete from inside and from the outside, right? That's what the Papua New Guinea, example was all about, saying, you know what, instead of doing your electricity grid, having China do it, Australia, New Zealand, the United States got together and said, we're going to put together a consortium, provide $2 billion in financing and the resources to do Papua New Guinea's electricity grid. Europe as well, said we're going to launch a whole connectivity initiative, and we're going to provide various ways of debt finance or commercial loans, subsidies for European companies to go in and to go head to head with China. Do both and at the same time. After all, by most consensus estimates, there's a $2-3 trillion shortfall in infrastructure finance across the Asian region over the next, say, 10-15 years. Even with all the money China claims to be putting on the table, and even with all the collective money put in the Belton Road kitty, it's not even a third of that.
Okay, I promised you, right back here. There we go. It's your turn.
Well, this is a little bit about individual agency.
Just take the mic if you would. Thank you.
Individual agency is something that was skirted around. This is mainly about systems, interacting systems on a large scale, on a global scale, which is quite right, and it was a very fine analysis indeed. But there are moments in history when individual agency gets a little more room for one or another reason, and this may be one of them. If you look at the United States and our leadership, we have a very peculiar kind of leadership, and it looks sort of unstable and maybe high risk if it can't be controlled. Russia doesn't seem to have that kind of appearance, but if you read Vladimir Putin's memoirs, his autobiography, when he tested for the KGB, you have to have an entrance exam to get into any good institution, including the KGB. I thought that was funny, but anyway. He scored as very high risk in his examination. So we have two high-risk leaders leading two great powers in the world, and they sometimes lean towards each other, as they have done over the years, the triangular relationship of the United States and China and Russia.
Sorry, this is really interesting. Is there a question there? Because there are other people who want to talk to them.
Are you willing to take into account individual agency in view of the strong systemic emphasis of your approach?
Great, thank you.
I mean, it's a very big question. That we do a lot of leadership analysis of not just Vladimir Putin, but of course Xi Jinping. There's a whole Kremlinology around him and his cult of personality and constitutional reforms, and what does that really mean? Is the Chinese system become all about him, or is there still something more? And what impact is his nationalism and the upbringing that has fueled his psychology? How does that impact his vision and his commitment for China's ambitions in Asia? And again, from that starting point, the analysis goes in many different directions around what people posit. None of us can be so truly inside his head. There are people who speak with absolute certainty and conviction about how his background dictates, his ambition. But again, whether it's the individual leader, Xi Jinping, or whether it is the Chinese state, again, I'm trying to, the complexity of the model has to take into account everyone's agency, right? And my bottom line on it is that for us, China looks like an unstoppable force, but others have agency too, and Asia is full of immovable objects, right? And it's not just an unstoppable force on a flat plane. Asia is full of these confident civilizations that are trying to also restore and resurrect their greatness. It's not just China.
Okay, time for about 2 or 3 more questions. All the way back here. Sorry. You've been ignored way back in the back room there.
Michael Froman. Back actually several countries that were part of the
Sorry, wait for the mic. Michael, yeah, there you go.
Michael Purvis with your company. You backpacked through several countries that were part of the Soviet Empire or indirectly or, under its influence. Can you just talk about more how they're navigating this multipolar game a little bit? I know you started touching on it, so you could expand on that.
Sure. Starting about 13, 14 years ago, I used this phrase multi-alignment. And again, we tend to view countries as needing to choose a side because we still kind of have this inertia of a Cold War psychology. You're with us, you're against us. Your country on a map is painted red or it's painted blue. It's a binary sort of choice. But that was a set of countries that I began to profile, over a decade ago. And I said, what these countries are doing? They're actually practicing a multi-alignment. They don't want to align only with America or only with China. Obviously, they still face and used to face even stronger pressures from Russia to be part of reconstituted versions of post-Soviet customs union and so forth. And they don't want to ally just with Europe. They want to be part of the NATO Partnership for Peace. They want American security guarantees and investment. They're taking oil pipelines and investments from China. They have growing ties and trade with India. All of the above. And that's what multi-alignment is all about. So when you ask me, how are these countries navigating, it's actually different conditions and different micro responses, but with the same principle in mind. And this deeply, deeply animates every single one of them, which is how can I not choose sides ever? Right? And it's very Asian in that way. As I was saying earlier, Asians don't believe in these rigid state-centric alliance patterns and formations. It's not part of Asian history, and it's not part of Asia's future. And it even applies to this, or maybe particularly to the states that are the most uncomfortable in their kind of modern sovereign skin because of the ways in which their borders were drawn. They didn't really have boundaries in this way in many cases until the 20th century. So, long story short, they want to be friends with everyone, and landlocked countries generally have to be.
Okay, one or two more questions. Up here, right here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Letty Almadin from the Philippine American Chamber of Commerce. And any thoughts on the Philippines and its relevance in the region, considering the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, however we call it?
Sure, I'll just say quickly, I don't think that the dominant frame through which we should view the Philippines, from a macro or long-term point of view is what happens with its South China Sea dispute. Because, in the way in which it's unfolded, as I've been observing now for a few years, is that more or less, again, the power differential is so vast, and the Philippines, whether it's voluntary or otherwise, decisions, again, small micro decisions, to effectively cede de facto control, not legal sovereignty, but de facto control over Spratly Islands to China, more or less becomes an irreversible fact. But that's not the central lens. That will not dictate the Philippines' sort of future in many ways. It's so much more about the fact that it's a young population, it's a fast-growing economy. A series of governments, even though they seem so different from each other, have actually been pursuing what you might even call a kind of a sort of consensus approach. In Latin America, you would have called the New Left consensus, right? Sort of infrastructure, pro-poor, social spending, all these kinds of things. You could call it the New Asian consensus, where governments are largely pragmatic and have a lot of continuity around these things, even Duterte. I actually talk about in the book how even previous governments that we had a lot more personal respect for had failed to do the kinds of education reforms that the Duterte government has done. And this is just matter of fact. I don't know him, like him, or otherwise. These are just facts. So this, accrual or accretion of positive kind of policies, or policies, leave the politics and personalities aside, the policies that we would want to see countries do, you're seeing when it comes to social development in a place like the Philippines. And it has high potential. And there's a set of countries that I point to in the book that, again, are multi-aligning. You've got the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and others that when it comes to trade, we're saying, sure, we want TPP. And if the U.S. doesn't join, we're still going to do TPP. But we're also going to do RCEP, right? And the sweet spot to be in terms of an investor-friendly country, a place where companies want to locate their supply chains, is a country that says, I want to join, all possible trade agreements. And so if you look at business surveys or otherwise, people are saying, hey, Philippines is a good place for me to be doing my manufacturing or whatever, and so is Vietnam and others. So from a policy standpoint, ultimately your fate is going to be determined by your policies in this economic kind of arena. The Philippines, among, again, these other set of ASEAN countries, are really doing a lot of the right things.
So, Mike, I'm going to give you the last word. Also, sort of put you on the spot. In your area of expertise, trade negotiation. We have a president now who prefers bilateral to multilateral agreements. I think it's fair to say, and he's
That's what I've heard.
Been very he's been very controversial. But play for the red team for a second. What's the best result that could come out with respect to Asia and trade from the Trump policy right now? Suppose he drew into an inside straight and it all worked. Then what does it look like?
Well, you'd get an agreement with China that both opened up their economy more to U.S. exports, but also dealt with a number of these structural reform issues. And by the way, I think, is an ability potentially to go down that road with the kinds of negotiations we were having with China on the bilateral investment treaty, which dealt with IPR and forced technology transfer and SOE disciplines, and got rid of equity caps and joint venture requirements, which are one of the mechanisms for encouraging technology transfer. So you get a comprehensive agreement with China and stabilize that relationship. They've announced a negotiation with Japan over a bilateral agreement. I think it will end up looking a lot like TPP. I think even the press release that announced it said that Japan wouldn't give anything more in it than they already gave in TPP, so that should be relatively easy to negotiate. Or hopefully they'll take TPP and then build on it whatever further steps they can get. I'm not sure who else will negotiate a bilateral agreement. It's possible others will over time. They certainly prefer the U.S. to come back to the CPTPP and some docking mechanism between the new NAFTA and the new TPP. But if that's not possible, it's conceivable that other countries will also step up in terms of wanting access to the U.S. market and being willing to engage bilaterally. And now we've seen with the new NAFTA, the text is about 85% TPP. So we know, and the other 15% matters. I mean, that's really where the Trump administration put their stamp on it. And I think countries are looking at it to say, can they live with those additions? To what degree are they positive? To what degree are they negative? And is that a basis on which to negotiate agreement? So playing for the red team, I think you would go around the region with the new NAFTA saying, this is our trade policy. Mm-hmm. Anybody willing to sign up here is welcome to sign a bilateral agreement with us.
Okay, with that, first of all, I want to thank all of you for being so attentive. Great questions. Thank you very much. And Parag, thank you, but also congratulations on your book. And Ambassador Mike Froman, really thanks a lot. It was great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Sorry about your cold, man.
I'm sorry.